Welcome back to the Hoopball YouTube channel. We have another strategy-based video for you guys today on personally one of my favorite topics and one of my good friends. You've seen him on this channel before. I noticed that a couple weeks back he wrote an article about this very topic, so it was great to bring Zach Hanshew back onto the show to talk with us about out-of-position stats in fantasy basketball. First of all, how you doing, Zach? How's it been since the last time you and I spoke?
Things have been good, man. Glad to be back here chatting with you, brother. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, of course, man. For you all didn't miss before. Zach and I did a live mock draft show about a month ago, diving into Yahoo's very early rankings. If you're watching, you have a fantasy draft coming up within the next week or so. Go ahead and check that out. There's plenty of stuff in there that has not that still has aged very well. The takes that he and I had, very much the same, just the order's been shifted around. So might have some fun seeing how the new draft board with Yahoo compares to that old one. But today we are just going to focus on something that, there's so much strategy when it comes to fantasy basketball, and we've already talked a lot about format-specific strategies, but this is one that, the format doesn't really matter, but it does. This is something that I've found over the years is really a key to succeeding in pretty much all my leagues, and that is out of position stats. Basically, searching for players that do something unique that the other crop of players in that same sort of positional category don't get nearly as much of. We're talking bigs like Nikola Jokic, who get a lot of assists from the center spot. Talking Russell Westbrook grabbing tons of rebounds from the point guard spot. We all know that, there's not many guys who can do what he can do. Shot blocking guards, wings who can, wings are kind of tricky. I don't really know. Wings can always kind of do everything, but, do it all wings, just different types of players and different sort of stat sets that just keep things interesting and fresh. And there's just a lot to get into about how you utilize them in the best way possible. So, Zach, first of all, talk to us a little bit about, why you chose to write about this. For Zach, by the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Zach the Monster. He writes for Fantasy Pros, and he released an article about 2 weeks back talking about this very specific topic. So what kind of led you to write about this, and how do you tend to implement these kinds of players into your strategies and your builds?
Yeah, man. So I think for a lot of the same reasons that you already touched on is kind of why I wanted to write this article, because looking for these and actually identifying these players that can offer value just beyond the traditional stats. As you mentioned, Nikola Jokic, he can pass from the big man spot. He's not only giving you rebounds and high field goal percentage, he's also handing out assists, and that's what pushes him over the edge as probably your number one fantasy player this year. And as you mentioned, Russell Westbrook can grab rebounds. Somebody like a Derek White, who's really good defensively, that's somebody that, maybe when you're picking at that spot, fifth or sixth round, you say, do I want Derek White or do I want, a comparable guard there? Well, if you're kind of lacking in some of those defensive numbers, maybe you went guard heavy early in your draft and you're looking to kind of make up a little bit of that in the mid rounds. And you think, man, I can get some more of those guard stats load up there. And then I can also, I'm not going to be lacking in those, defensive numbers that are typical for a big man. So those are the kind of ways that I would like to look at that as far as, my strategy goes. And then just for some late round picks, I really think if you understand who these guys are and what they can offer you just outside of the norm, that can also kind of sway you for what your final picks are going to be and kind of just give you an edge at the very tail end of your draft.
Yeah, and I like that at the end there you touched about how late round picks tend to find a lot of guys who kind of fit this criteria. There's a lot of the NBA is filled with tons of unique players, especially in today's game where the league has shifted smaller and quicker. That has led to a lot of different types of players, statistically unique players emerging. Draymond Green is a perfect example of a guy who satisfies a lot of these different spots. He's basically a forward, but he plays a lot of center. So he gets you a really unique amount of assists, in steals, which you typically don't see from big men. He can get you involved in rebounds. He's kind of one of those pioneers. These kind of players have always existed, but he sort of revolutionized small ball in a lot of ways, which has opened up just, the floor for someone like a Jay Tate, who last year hopped on the scene and great steals guy, like you would expect from a wing, but he also had really good rebounding and high field goal percentage numbers, which are typically, reserved for bigger guys. And I think one of the ways that I usually implement players with these unique types of skill sets the most is when I'm punting, like where I'm trying to gain an edge in, this is specific to category leagues, but if I'm trying to gain an edge in, I don't know, 6 of those 9, a lot of times these kinds of players tend to have a lot more value than they would have in a vacuum. Uh, for example, let's just say that you are trying to, let's say that you're trying to punt. I don't know. Let's say you want to punt blocks specifically, which is a stat that's reserved for a lot of big men. There are certain bigs in the NBA who don't block shots. Think Domantas Sabonis or Julius Randle. They are very valuable players, but a lot of it has a little bit more to do with their value in assists. In a punt blocks build, they fit that bill way better than your Clint Capellas or your I don't know, like I'm going to keep listing shot blocking centers like Rudy Gobert or Jared Allen, where it's all tied to block shots. But I mean, the point is, like, these kinds of guys like Sabonis and Randall, they can help you out with rebounds and field goal percentage, the two of those big men stats that you would search for them for. But they also kind of get involved in other areas, all while not, the big drawback being that category that you're punting in. So I mean, I'm sort of rambling, but I think I'm making it clear, like, sort of how these kinds of players, it can be very influential to how you punt. Is there a particular punt build, Zach, that you like to sort of kind of that you feel that these players help you most with, maybe even just for this year specifically?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, man. I don't know that I've necessarily thought about what my favorite punt build is this year for these
Mm-hmm.
out of position categories. I definitely like what you mentioned as far as the punt blocks, because that typically kind of tends to lean towards, more guard heavy build.
Mm-hmm.
But no, to be honest with you, I have not really considered that this year. I'll throw that back to you, man. Is there a certain type of build that you're favoring this year for these type of players?
Yeah, I mean, and it's sort of like one that's just I've found that is relatively helpful is are builds that kind of, well, I'll say, well, I guess there's two different ways to go about this. I mean, the one I referenced was like the punt blocks build has been one that I've had a lot of success with because
Mhm.
there are more big men in the NBA who are capable of doing that have fantasy value that goes beyond the traditional box score and the traditional, sorry, big men stats. Sabonis and Randall ranking pretty high up there as guys who are very valuable that don't block a lot of shots. I found that it's easy to build around those guys, especially where everyone's hunting centers who kind of do the opposite. It sort of creates. I can take them earlier in these kinds of builds than I would normally, and still feel like you know, I'm getting relative value from that spot. I find another way to look at this and beyond punt builds too is to sort of positional scarcity in drafts is a thing that exists too. This year in particular, a lot of people talk about how centers dry up very quickly in the middle rounds. Do you feel that there is a way to work around that is to target some of these guards like a Derek White or a Jay Tate, or I don't know, like some other, is there other like other guards who provide big man stats that kind of help you work around that?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely interesting for this year because there is a clear kind of tier break off with centers, and especially as you mentioned right there in the middle rounds,
Mm-hmm.
kind of where you get into, and I think the middle rounds of drafts this year in general are there's a lot of uncertainty to where I haven't quite seen that in years past, where you're looking at guys and, well, do I want to take this guy here? And almost everybody kind of feels like a reach in those middle rounds.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I definitely think targeting guards that can provide you some of those big man stats, and maybe not necessarily in the middle rounds. I think a Derek White in the middle rounds is somebody that's going to help you obviously with the blocks. But I
Mm-hmm.
think towards the end of drafts, you can still get quite a bit of value for some of those big man stats out of guards. You get a Matisse Tybel as far as the defensive stats. You can get guys at the end of drafts who are, really good at shooting, like TJ McConnell, Joe Harris. And then you can pull down some rebounds there at the end. I know somebody we kind of chatted about offline, Josh Hart, is a perfect one, towards the end of drafts. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts there?
No, I completely agree. It's something that's been very, very helpful in particular builds that I've gone with, and in particular roto leagues. These guys are where they really shine. Like whereas a roto league, you only get a certain amount of players that you can play per positional slot on your roster, and especially for late season gamesmanship, if you are trying to make up ground, let's say in rebounds, and you want to stack, and you still have, I don't know, like 10 guards that you need to play for a certain week, having guys like Josh Hart who could come in can really help you with rebounds in a way akin to how a center could. They really shine in that capacity. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of when you settle on whatever kind of punt build you're in, knowing which guys, which out of position guys that fit that criteria. If it's more guard centric or center centric, is very valuable. And it's also just valuable to have a running list when you're going into your drafts, in case, because we all have run into the situation before where you have a guy that you really want to target. You're trying to go with this particular build that you're rolling with, but then you realize, like, oh my gosh, I don't have any centers on my team. And you kind of are forced into taking someone who might not fit the criteria as well. So I'd recommend that you kind of get yourself acquainted with who some of these guys are, because like you mentioned at the top, Zach, a lot of them are available in the later rounds of drafts. Let's focus on a little bit more of like just specific names this year that maybe that help some of the viewers here build those lists out. Let's talk. I don't know if you're who are some good play out of position. Do you have any out of position assists guys late in drafts that you can think of off the top of your head? I got a couple I could go with, but I want to kick it to you and see if there's anyone you can think of to share with people first.
Yeah, there's two that immediately come to mind. As far as a passing big man, you got to love Al Horford this year.
Oh yeah,
And I think today I saw you on Twitter talking up Al Horford. And
sounds like me.
yeah, I mean, he's very underrated this year. I think he's kind of been forgotten about.
Yeah.
But he really does a lot of those things that, that you love out of a big man that big men typically don't do. He's great from the free throw line.
Mm-hmm.
He's great passing big man. So, you get a twofer there with him in the later rounds. And Mason Plumlee is
Mm.
another guy that, he always hands out, decent assists for a big man.
Yeah, no
He was
doubt.
actually 11th in the league last year in assists per game. So I think that's pretty impressive.
Another guy that I'm thinking about right now who has been a little off the radar in draft seasons, but I've recently come around on, like within the last few days, as it's become more clear that he's going to be sticking around this team into the regular season. But Thaddeus Young is another
Hmm.
name who last year, Thagic Johnson for the Bulls. This man was dishing out 5-6 assists per game. It's unclear if that's going to be his role in San Antonio, but as of now, it appears that he's going to be sticking around until they can find a trade for him. He's going past those 100 picks, and he is another forward eligible guy. Can play some small ball 5 too, although I doubt he has any real center eligibility. But regardless, he's one of those guys that comes to mind for me, who can provide those out of position assists. As is someone like Kelly Olynyk, who we saw get into a good deal of that in Houston. Be curious to see if that's the same case in Detroit. But you definitely took two of my favorites in Al Horford and Plumlee in that regard. Those are two great guys who can fill those needs for you later on, especially if you kind of neglected to get assists early in the draft, which happens a lot of the time because point guards always go quick. How about what about in these later rounds? Any bigs that can stretch the floor in a pretty meaningful way? Because those guys, there's a lot of them in the league these days, but they also tend to go pretty early, like your Porzingises and your Jaren Jackson Juniors, and I mean, hell, Anthony Davis and Jokic and Embiid also do that too. But can you think of any bigs in those late rounds that also can help satisfy that criteria?
Yeah, the two that I wrote up for my article were, Larry Markkinen, which his playing time kind of remains to be seen. Evan
Yeah, it's
Mobley's just
dicey.
been tearing up the preseason,
Yeah.
so not sure what's going to happen there. But I mean, he's a dude that can definitely stroke it from downtown.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Morris is another one.
Mm-hmm.
Davis Bertans. He kind of fell off last year, but
As
I
a,
mean that's pretty much his entire game is triples.
yeah.
But I mean, if you're looking for, so those are kind of late round guys. If you're looking for a guy maybe like in the 7th or 8th round,
Mhm.
I love a guy like PJ Washington, man, just because of everything that he can do as far as the elite defensive numbers, and then he can also step out and make a three. So he's probably my favorite as far as a big man that can shoot threes, just for the value that you're getting with him.
Yeah, PJ's a great one to reference, and he's. I've got a lot of high expectations for him this season. Just I feel that Charlotte has really kind of made a scenario where there's more runway for him to be a backup center more of the time. Getting, it's him and Mason Plumlee really. It remains to be seen if Vernon Carey Jr. can get involved in that capacity. But yeah, he's a great one. Marcus Morris is another one that comes to mind. He's going to be playing a lot of small ball center for Los Angeles this year in particular. Bobby Portis is not like a 3-point bomber by any means, but he has always been someone who has some range. Brooke Lopez, similar, the guy starting in front of him, he's going pretty late in drafts, and he's another guy who, for a while now, has been able to satisfy that particular category. I mean, it's never been easier to find guys like that. But in particular, if you're in builds that are going more guard heavy, Washington's a fantastic choice for a big man who can help you with more guard and wing like stats. I'll give you some center eligibility, so that's a really good one there. Let's talk a little bit of guards though. Rebounding guards. You mentioned Russell Westbrook, who really everyone knows he's the triple double king. But there's plenty of guards who are also just as capable. Who are some of your favorite rebounding guards that you're looking at this year?
Yeah, probably my favorite. I think I mentioned his name earlier is Josh Hart.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I really did think it was interesting last year. He was second among all guard eligible players in rebounds per game. He had 8 rebounds a game last season. So
He gets better at it every year.
yeah, that's what it seems like. And I mean, with this Zion injury and just all the turnover they've had in the backcourt,
Mm-hmm.
you just kind of think he's going to see some more run and maybe even eclipsing that 8 per game this season doesn't seem completely crazy.
Yeah.
And another guy that maybe you want to take a chance on late in drafts. I'm not sure what his health is, so if he's not healthy, obviously scratch him. But Dante DiVincenzo is a guy that
Mm,
consistently does pull down rebounds at a pretty high clip for a guard, and he goes just way late in drafts.
yeah. There's a few guards this year that can do that. DiVincenzo, though, I think he's definitely getting slept on because of that injury, and justifiably so. I wouldn't necessarily draft him yet either, I don't think. But thinking of other guards who can really help you in that particular area, 2 late in rounds that come to mind are DeAnthony Melton and Malachi Flynn.
Mm,
Melton that probably has a clearer path to playing time this year, particularly with news that Dylan Brooks is going to miss a few weeks to start the season.
yeah.
But Flynn is another guy who rookie last year got a lot of playing time when Kyle Lowry and Fred VanVleet were hurt. I think he's going to have a nice role this season where he was a guy who was able to get it done, kind of a triple double threat kind of guy. He's probably not going to pull those kinds of numbers, but he has that capacity because of his propensity to grab some boards. Early round guys that come to mind are like LaMelo Ball and DeJounte Murray. A lot of hype around both. Part of their calling cards are that they are just they're long, athletic guards who can mix it up down low in that capacity. Trying to think if there's anyone else that's pretty noteworthy. I mean, those are some of my favorite late and early round targets, and there's definitely a lot more that you can seek out. I had one in my mind, but I think I just spaced it. It's fine though. Let's go one more unique stat set here. How about? Do you have any? That's kind of tough. What about guards with good field goal percentage? That's always really efficient guards are always interesting because they could get it done in a few different ways. You could either be guys who just attack the rack a lot. There are just some guys in the NBA who can't miss. So yeah, they just are fantastic. I mean, those kinds of players are probably really just going to probably carry a bunch of other categories. But like someone I mentioned earlier, like Jayshawn Tate. Who is sort of a small wingish guard who can get about half of his shots in. Is there any Anyone else that you can think of that really kind of like can help you out in that particular area?
Yeah, so if we're talking about guys, guards in particular with high field goal percentage, two that come to mind right away are going to be Joe Harris and T.J. McConnell.
Very good ones.
McConnell doesn't take a ton of shots, but he shot better than 50% for his career.
Mhm.
And Joe Harris, he's just always lights out, and I mean he's a dude that shot over the last 4 seasons 49.5%. Which over half of his shots are triples. So I mean that's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
And then if we're looking at early round guys, guys like a Mikal Bridges, a Drew Holiday,
Drew
Ben
is a good one. Yeah.
Simmons, yeah, SGA, guys like that.
Yeah, guards that typically tend to take less threes do
Hmm.
get that benefit. Like TJ McConnell's a great example. He's not much of a 3-point shooter. He gets most of his buckets at the rim.
Yeah,
Jimmy Butler is another guy who fits that criteria in the early
yeah,
rounds. He takes no threes at all. I think he shot close to 50% from the floor last season.
right.
Like it's typically, in a punt 3-pointers build, you will find a lot of guards who can help
Hmm.
satisfy those conditions, except for Joe Harris, who just what
Yeah,
his efficiency combined with that 3-point percentage is kind of definitely an oddity. For him, that he's more unique in that capacity. I guess it helps when you have 2 to 3 guys on your team who are the greatest scorers of all time. So
yeah,
no,
right.
nobody really needs to pay you much time. Um, but yeah, Colin Sexton's another one that comes to mind
Hmm.
as a very hyper efficient guard, both from the field and the line. But he doesn't take a ton of threes. But what's special about him is that he just gets it done from all over the floor. One of the league's best scoring guards, period, right now.
Right.
But yeah, there's always plenty of guys you can seek out. I guess the other side of that would be big men with good touch from the free throw line, because guys like Shaq and Howard have, maybe they gave the big guys a little bit of a bad reputation, but then you see Jakob Pertl kind of carrying that mantle as well. So a lot of them don't have very good strokes. So let's end it on that. Who are some of the best bigs from the charity stripe that you can think of for drafts this season?
Yeah, so we already mentioned Al Horford. So he gives you the free throw percentage and the assists.
Yeah.
Kelly Olynyk's another one who is
Mm-hmm.
really good from the free throw line. And if you want to take a shot on him, if you think he's gonna have a pretty big role, even with Isaiah Stewart coming on,
Mm-hmm.
he's a guy. And Brooke Lopez, another guy that you already mentioned. He's usually really good from the free throw line.
He does have a good stroke there. Makes up for his uh, the wacky sort of reverse there, where he used to be this dominant low post scorer, but now he only takes 3, so his field goal percentage is pretty terrible.
Right.
But 2 guys in the mid rounds that I really like, because they are both really good at at both field goal and free throw, is Rashawn Holmes and Jonas Valanciunas.
Hmm.
Both have really solid touch from the line. I think that they're very appealing bigs to pair with if you're really trying to run things up. Like, you can say you draft Steph Curry with your first pick, who's also fantastic at both percentages. Pairing him with those bigs to get that shot blocking while not sacrificing percentages is something that I really like doing. So those 2 are pretty solid in that capacity. I'm trying to think if there's any. Miles Bridges is also one of those guys who has a pretty, like, he's not a center necessarily, but he does have a pretty good stroke from the free throw line, and he does get there, enough get with those combination of boards and blocks that he usually brings to the table. He's kind of got an interesting stat set in that capacity. I'm trying to think if there's anyone else that really comes to mind, but like at least in the late rounds. I guess we kind of touched on Marcus Morris as a 3-point specialist. He doesn't help you in field goal percentage, but he does have a good stroke from the free throw line. There's just there's an interesting collection. You can have your Morrises and Lopez's who have great free throw percentage, but have that trade off of they get you a lot of threes, but pretty bad field goal percentage. But then
Mhm.
there's certain guys like Holmes and Valanciunas who are your traditional bigs that also have decent touch. Isaiah Stewart is not necessarily there yet, though he did have some. He has displayed some capacity at the free throw line. I think he shot when you look at his splits as a starter last year. Not that starting or coming off the bench has any influence here, but those games isolated, he was about a 76% shooter from the line, which is not all that bad. So he's someone I'm definitely watching with some potential in that capacity. But as y'all can tell, there's a lot of different options to go with here. I think that Zach and I have outlined a lot for drafts this upcoming season. But if you want to get the down low, you really want to see, the full breadth that Zach has in store for you, go check out his article on Fantasy Pros. Where can people? What's the title of that article? Where can people find that, Zach?
Yeah, it's called Out of Position Categories. It's over at Fantasy Pros.
All right, it was that simple. I didn't know. I should have just had it by the screen right here. I wasn't sure what the specific title was, but that is. I'll put that in my producer notes for later as something that I should make sure I have handy. But yeah, man, love throwing ideas off the wall with you. Again, you can follow him on Twitter at Zach the Monster. You can check out both fantasy basketball and fantasy football work from you over on that side of things. If you're into both, Zach is your man. And yeah, anything else that you want to plug before we get on out of here, Zach?
No, that's about it, man. I just want to say thanks again for having me, brother. It's always a pleasure.
Well, man, you are always welcome here. I really appreciate getting to do something else with you. And, I know this won't be the last time that we'll talk and that you will be here talking to the Hoop Ball faithful. But yeah, if y'all appreciated this video, if you like the strategy conversation, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, follow Zach on Twitter, follow at Hoop Ball Fantasy on Twitter. I'm Alan Soroki. We will check in with you guys next time on another video talking about something else related to fantasy basketball. I'll see y'all later.